Hi guys, so this is Miss Sailor. We'll be doing this discussion on just day one, an introduction to the class. This is dual credit, U.S. History with Lufkin High School. On occasion, I'm just letting you guys know now, on occasion you will get my other teacher, Mr. Gonzalez. We are both recording, so sometimes you may hear and see him instead of me. Just letting you guys know. So what we will discuss, myself, I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about myself, why study history, facts of U.S. history, the class requirements and readings, and then our basic analysis of everything, okay? Okay, a little bit about me. I have a bachelor's degree in history with a minor in philosophy from Stephen F. Austin State University. I also received my master's in public history from SFA in 2019. Public history means that I usually would typically go into a work field with museums or archives. My actual specialization, if anyone is curious, is on the movements of hate organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and their effects on small communities and the way they remember the past. So yes, I am married. We travel quite often. I don't have any children. I do have pets. We like to travel and do a few different things. I will upload a slideshow at one point that will feature some different sites along the East Coast, so you guys might geographically better understand where some of the readings are talking about. So, let's talk about history a little bit. It succeeds when it tells us how things were. Yet at the same time, it reminds us that the only the only access we have to the past is through the imagination, and because of that, we must always remember that history now is an interpretation of things. So, why study history? What even is history? So originally, history is an attempt to tell a story, to explain and even analyze the past. Many insist that the past in itself is unknowable, and that history represents our collective efforts to make sense of the world. Our most important stories, especially stories about ourselves, may be true, or at least ground in truth, but historians remain concerned with approximating the truth about the past on the basis of available evidence. So that's why you have things like historical research. It's the process of discovery and construction. So the historian is going to investigate what has happened in the past by using viable and available evidence in order to establish the facts and chronologically the events as they happened. So no amount of the past is free of perspectives, is free of prejudice and priorities of its author. You have to understand that. In the greatest sense, you have to remind yourself that history is written by the victors, typically. Today we have a much more different approach when it comes to writing history, because the field itself as a profession has tried to make motions to move away from the concept of just writing down great white man history. So while being committed to a particular interpretation, the historian must remain faithful to the evidence and determined to test the accuracy and the adequacy of every historical account. So history succeeds when it tells us how things were, yet at the same time reminds us that the only access we have to the past is through imagination, okay? So just like I said at the beginning. So the available evidence, as you can see what I've written, is things like written records, archives, manuscripts, maps, documents, but also things like photographs and paintings, coins, tapes, videos, records. Things like this are evidence that historians use to tell the story of history. So from this, history must aspire to construct and tell the story about the evidence of the past. So in seeking to understand and explain past events by interpreting their meanings, historians know they live in a present where bias and interpretation of the past abound. They must understand their own bias, which is how historians are trained. We must understand the concept that we are biased, but we must remain objective when we write. Okay, so they identify causes that will help explain why or how events happened the way that they did. So on this slide, you can see I have factors of U.S. history. American history and the way it was written has passed through 4 main stages, okay? The providential, it took place during the 17th century. Think of it like the U.S. as a whole takes the place of New England as the model of Christian virtue from the corrupt old world. If that makes any sense to you guys, maybe not. So what it is you have Puritans in this stage who are writing down history. So they try to emulate a more Christian virtue in their historical writings, which affects the interpretation. So then you have the rationalist. These are intellectuals. These are people like Newton and Locke and French philosophers. They are seeing history like the physical universe as subject to natural law. The new story they are telling in history books was one of progress and reason. So the progress of reason in human affairs. Then you have the nationalists. These are men who possessed classical education. They had private libraries and leisure time to do this research and this writing. So this writing is more refined and elusive than the previous prose by the Puritan predecessors of the providential. They write history, though, for their own satisfaction, which again affects the way history is written. And finally, you have the professional. A profession like any other, but unfortunately it has its own issues. It would be practiced by only people who had access to advanced education during the 19th century, which of course was white males. This changes later. Because the study of history becomes influenced in the 1960s by new social history, which begins to look at history from the bottom up. Social historians begin to find copious evidence of conscious thought and actions among what was considered the lower people. You have things like the emergence of slave narratives, diaries of farm wives, articles in obscure newspapers, even court and police records begin to become sources of historical narration. So it changes, again, the way people write history. So it's very interesting how much history, the writing of history, and U.S. history, the way it's interpreted, has changed over time. So, I kind of wanted to go over that today. and then I want to talk to you guys about the class requirement. But I am going to do that in part 2. So hold on a second.